welcome to day 3 of Preemie Power Week. I'm Fabiana Bacchini, Executive Director of the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation, CPBF, and also your host for this event. The Preemie Power Week is the second of 2 international live series that CPBF is hosting 2020 in recognition of World Prematurity Day. These education sessions are in collaboration with the International Family Integrated Care Committee, the Canadian Association of Neonatal Nurses, EFCNI, and GLANCE, the Global Alliance for the Newborn Care. For those not familiar with CPBF, we are a charitable organization, and our mission is to support and educate Canadian families of premature babies every step of the way. We believe that through consistent information, access to helpful resources, and peer support inside and outside an ICU, we can empower families, ensuring they are ready to care for their baby. Consistent information is especially important today when we are facing a global pandemic. With educational sessions like this, we intend to bring the guidance of healthcare professionals and the knowledge gathered by researchers around the world. These are valuable tools to help our community raise awareness and advocate for the well-being of families and their babies. I would like to thank AbbVie for the unrestricted educational grant and Pampers for supporting the Preemie Power Week. And right now, we're going to talk about milk and microbes, how breastfeeding and gut bacteria shape lifelong health. The Azad Lab is studying how breastfeeding and human milk shape the infant microbiome and contribute to infant growth, child development, and lifelong health. And sharing the screen now with me is Dr. Meghan Azad, who is an associate professor of pediatrics and child health at the University of Manitoba. She holds a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Developmental Origins of Chronic Disease and co-directs the New Manitoba Interdisciplinary Lactation Center. Her research program is focused on the role of infant nutrition and the microbiome in child growth, development, and resilience. Dr. Azad serves on the International Society for Research in Human Milk and Lactation Executive Council, and she joined the US-Canada Human Milk Composition Initiative. Dr. Azad, thank you so much for joining us here today. It's such a pleasure to talk to you and learn more about your research.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. A belated happy World Prematurity Day to you and the audience. And I'm excited to tell you about some of the research we're doing in my lab around human milk and the microbes within it. So what I hope to cover here today is to discuss how breastfeeding and the mode, duration, and exclusivity of breastfeeding modify the effects of that exposure, to discuss the role of breastfeeding and the microbiome in infant health and development, and to identify bioactive components of human milk and describe their potential role in shaping the microbiome. So I want to start with personalized medicine. And I know the audience is a mix of clinicians and parents and maybe researchers as well. And I think this means something a little bit different to each of us. It's what I would call a buzzword right now in clinical medicine. And I think when many people see this term, they think about medications or therapies or even personalized diet programs or exercise programs. But really, it's the idea of a treatment that is personalized to the individual. So we know that one size fits all recommendations don't work for everyone, and personalization is a real trend right now. But when I personally think about personalized medicine, I think about human breast milk. And so this is a quote that I love from the recent Lancet series on breastfeeding. And if what you learned today in my talk is exciting to you, I recommend going to this series. There's a couple of papers that really do a good job of summarizing the current evidence around breastfeeding and its critical role in infant health, as well as a second paper on the economic perspective of that. And so this quote by Cesar Vectora says that human breast milk is not only a perfectly adapted nutritional supply for the infant, but probably the most specific personalized medicine that he or she is likely to receive, given at a time when gene expression is being fine-tuned for life. So I love this quote because it encapsulates so much of my research in one sentence. And I highlighted there, fine-tuned for life, because this gets at the concept of a critical period. So we talk often about the first 1,000 days in my area of research. looking at the developmental origins of health and chronic diseases. And this captures not from the day you're born, but from the day you're conceived, so the whole of pregnancy, and then out to about your second birthday. And that, of course, is the period when breastfeeding is recommended. And so I think when you think of that concept of critical periods of development, those first 1,000 days is when our brain is still developing, our immune system is developing, our microbiome is developing. And so this is such a critical period. And if that's when breastfeeding occurs, then there's probably a lot going on besides just delivering food to the infant that is impacting those critical periods of development. And so why am I interested in breastfeeding? Well, aside from what I just mentioned in terms of it occurring in this critical period of early development, it's also really important for the microbiome. And so this is a paper that I published 7 years ago now as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Alberta. And it was my first connection with the child cohort study, which I'll tell you more about. And you can see here that it made the cover of the Canadian Medical Association Journal. It was one of the early papers talking about how infant diet, so meaning breastfeeding versus formula, shapes the infant gut microbiome. The microbiome being all these trillions of organisms, microorganisms, bacteria, and fungi that live in and on our bodies. And so this made a lot of headlines at the time. And we also did a follow-up study where we looked out to a year of age. The first paper looked at 3 months. And this was my experience early on in the microbiome field. And when we were studying the microbiome, one of the main findings was really that breastfeeding was one of, if not the most important factor shaping the microbiome early in life. So when I moved on from that postdoctoral research position to start my own lab here at the University of Manitoba, I wanted to keep working with the child cohort study because they're an amazing group. This is a national study across Canada, and I decided to take a focus within that large study on breastfeeding. And so you can see here, the child study is national. We've recruited families, almost 3,600 of them, from 4 provinces in Canada. And so they're shown here on the map. We have families from Vancouver, Edmonton, Manitoba, which is where I am, and Toronto. And so this is a large project. I need to acknowledge right up front, over 40 researchers are involved, spanning 20 disciplines. So everything from obstetrics, neonatology, pediatrics, immunology, nutrition, you name it. It's a great team to be a part of. This family study has been going on since about 2010 when we recruited pregnant women. We've been following them and their children ever since to understand how genes and the environment shape early life health trajectories. And so initially our questions were focused around asthma and allergies, which are some of the first chronic diseases to appear in early life. But as the children get older, because we are still following them, they're now around 10 years old, we're starting to look at other outcomes as well. The word genes is on the screen. So we are looking at genetics because conditions like asthma and allergies tend to run in families, showing that there is a genetic component to them. But at the same time, these conditions have skyrocketed in the last couple of decades, and that is much faster than our genes evolve. So we know that the environment is playing a role. And in the child study, we've really asked at a very broad level, how is the environment impacting our genes and our health? And so that includes everything from the indoor home environment, what cleaning chemicals we're using, what kind of furniture we have, to the outdoor environment, looking at things like air quality, and then components that you might not normally think of as the environment, like stress or infections or socioeconomic factors, as well as nutrition and the microbiome. And so we've had the families complete dozens of surveys over the years, as well as provide us with biological samples. And those include stool, which is what we use to study the infant microbiome, but also breast milk, which of course is my new favorite sample in the study and what I'll focus on today. And so through my work in the microbiome, as I mentioned, I got really interested in breastfeeding. And so firstly, we're asking questions about breastfeeding or breast milk feeding, and you'll see why I make that distinction in a moment, and how those patterns of feeding are associated with different health outcomes. So I highlighted asthma and allergies as some of our main interests. And then in the child study, because we've collected breast milk samples, we have the opportunity to dig deeper and say, what is it in milk that is driving those connections? And so there are many components in milk, and I'll touch on a few of them today. And then we also have, from all those surveys, lots of information about the mothers, both modifiable factors like their diet and fixed factors like their genetics, age, or ethnicity. And so we're able to ask questions about how do those fixed and modifiable factors affect milk composition, but also how do they affect a mother's ability or decision to breastfeed, and how do they impact the child's health totally apart from breastfeeding. And that's an important piece of the puzzle to keep in mind when you're doing this type of research. We also have information on different possible mechanisms within the infant. So I mentioned the microbiome or the gut bacteria as my reason for getting interested in breastfeeding, but we also have information about epigenetics, so how genes are turned on and off in the infant, immunity and lung function, and these are all things that might be affected by breast milk. So we can study that part of the puzzle too. And then our goal with this research is ultimately to be able to inform interventions in the next generation of babies to either support breastfeeding, to maybe optimize milk composition, or to address some of those underlying factors. So starting with that first question about breastfeeding and health outcomes and the connection between them, I'll give you one example from the child study. And so the way we collect this information is through questionnaires. And this is not for you to read, but just to emphasize that we've asked repeatedly the mothers to tell us about how they're feeding their babies. And a lot of studies might just ask, are you breastfeeding? Yes or no. But we've asked a lot more questions than that. So we've asked how exclusively, we've asked if they are formula feeding, what brand of formula. We've asked, are they using glass bottles or plastic bottles, about the introduction of other foods. And one question that we asked that I hadn't even realized initially was about pumping. And this becomes important, and it really only came to my attention because of a pediatric resident who was coming to me with a research project idea. And she had just done a rotation in the NICU, working with premature babies. And she saw that many of them are receiving their mother's own milk, but it had been pumped and then fed either in a tube or in a bottle. And she wondered if that made a difference. And now in the child study, we don't have any premature babies. It's a cohort of healthy full-term infants. But we did ask this question about pumping. And to be honest, that question was asked by the environmental scientists because they then went on to ask further questions about glass bottles and plastic bottles. They're interested in those chemical exposures, but we're able to use this information for other purposes. And so we went back and reanalyzed some of our data about breastfeeding and asthma, as well as obesity, but I'll show you asthma as one example. So this is a graph showing data from the child study where we looked at the development of asthma by 3 years of age, and we divided the babies into 4 groups based on how they were fed. So this first group is those receiving direct breast milk only, meaning they only received breast milk and it was always directly fed at the breast. And then on the other side, we have infants receiving by 3 months of age formula only from a bottle. And so this group of formula-fed babies have the highest risk of asthma by 3 years of age, and the group of directly breastfed babies have the lowest. But in between that, we see a group of babies that are receiving a combination of formula and breast milk, and also a group that are still only receiving breast milk, but they're receiving some of that pumped and fed from a bottle. And so we can see that any other method aside from feeding directly at the breast was associated with an increased risk of asthma. And that was true once we accounted for a lot of those underlying factors that I mentioned. So things like whether a mom had asthma herself, whether she had gone back to work, and so on. And that's what these dots at the top are showing, that these patterns still hold even after we account for those factors. So a question I have for all of you, and we'll see if maybe this can work out to be interactive, is in the comments, I want you to guess or tell me your ideas. Why would it be different, the effect of feeding directly at the breast versus feeding from a bottle? And so I'll watch the comments and see what you all come up with, because this is something that we puzzled over. I would have to say that myself and Annika, that pediatric resident, were kind of surprised to see this, because we thought if it's all about the milk, it shouldn't really matter how you're feeding it. But we did see these differences. And so we asked ourselves, well, why might that be? So I see bottle sometimes is frozen. Right. So once you pump milk, if it's going in the fridge or in the freezer, then I mentioned there are all these different components in milk. So maybe they're changing or becoming degraded once you freeze the milk. I'm watching to see if there are other ideas. Other things that we thought about are that there's this physical lung exercise. So there have been some research looking at babies and how hard they have to suck on a bottle versus at the breast. And so that might be actually a form of stimulating lung development that is different. I see differences in antibodies, no exchange between baby and mom. Yes, exactly. So that's the point there, infant to mother signaling. So there's some research showing that when an infant is suckling at the breast, there's a bit of backwash that occurs. And so you have a signal from the baby to the mom that maybe is signaling this baby is sick and needs more antibodies. I've also put on here skin-to-skin contact. So this idea that babies, when they're at the breast, are getting skin-to-skin contact with their mom. And that can be important for bonding, for temperature regulation, also for microbes. And so I'm going to talk more about microbes today. And that might be skin microbes from the mom that are not getting transferred to the baby if the baby is bottle fed. And then I see chemicals in the bottle. Right. So are there chemicals in the bottle or the pumping apparatus that might be contaminating the milk? Many good ideas. And so you guys are good scientists thinking of many of the things that we did. So moving then to another part of this puzzle, the microbiome. And this is, again, sort of when we saw that difference in pumping, we thought, well, is this related to the microbiome? Is there something different in the microbiome once milk is pumped? So the first question is breastfeeding and the microbiome. I mentioned that we had seen in our early publications that there was a very strong link here. And this is one example of that data. This is a more recent paper where instead of studying the first 20 or 100 infants from the cohort, we've actually studied more than 1,000. And the different colors here are representing different feeding groups. So in black, you have babies who were not receiving any breast milk. In the middle, you have those that are receiving some breast milk and some formula. And then on the right, those that are receiving only breast milk. And you can see a difference in the diversity of their microbiomes. That's one way that we study the microbiome. Another is by looking at what we call the microbial age. And you see a difference there as well. And then in the bottom here, we're looking at the whole composition of the microbiome. And in this case, when dots are close together, they're very similar in terms of their microbiomes. And when they're further apart, they're different. And you can see that the communities of microbes are different in babies who are formula fed versus breastfed. And what was also really interesting, this is another nuance that many studies don't look at. So pumping is one example that is often not captured. Another is feeding in the first days of life. So we asked mothers to complete those surveys that I showed you, but we also had access to their hospital records from when they delivered. And what we found was that when we went back to those hospital delivery records, there was a substantial proportion, about 25% of moms who said they exclusively breastfed their infants. When we asked them, we found that their babies actually got a little bit of formula in the first day or two of life. And whether they forgot or they just literally answered the question we asked, which said, did you ever feed formula? And it may have been a nurse. We're not sure. We maybe should have phrased the question differently. But regardless, there is this group of babies that got what I would call just one bottle on their first day of life. And when we looked at their microbiome, 3 months later, remember, we could find some differences in their microbiome. They still look most like the exclusively breastfed babies, but there were slight differences, not in the overall profile, but in certain types of bacteria, like bifidobacteria, which are thought to be beneficial. So we still don't know what kind of health impact this might have, but it is an important clue that early breastfeeding has an important impact on the microbiome. So I've shown you that breastfeeding impacts the microbiome, that breastfeeding is linked with asthma and other outcomes. But how is this occurring? Is it the gut microbiome that is mediating that impact? And so for that, we've done some research on atopy and wheezing in the child cohort. Here we're dividing the babies into whether they are remaining healthy or whether they develop atopy or wheezing or both. And here the different colors are representing different bacteria. And we did find that babies who went on to develop atopy and wheezing, which is an early sign of asthma, were missing several microbes in their gut microbiome. And we took it one step further from just observing this in the babies to studying these bacteria in mice. And we found when we took those missing bacteria and put them into mice, and then had those mice develop asthma, they were protected if they received those missing bacteria. So this was a clue that these bacteria are really important, and they really seem to be important in the very early stages of infancy in terms of preventing the development of allergic diseases and asthma. So those are the different kind of pieces of the puzzle. I want to spend the last few minutes focusing on the breast milk itself. Because from the information I've showed you so far, we have evidence that breastfeeding is linked to health outcomes, that it impacts the microbiome, and that the microbiome impacts health outcomes. So that to me is really strong motivation to go back and look at the breast milk and say, what is it in the breast milk that is driving those relationships? So these are two pictures that give you about the same message, which is that there are a lot of things in breast milk that are not found in the alternative, which is infant formula. So while formula contains the main building blocks that a baby needs for growth, including macronutrients and micronutrients, there are a whole host of things that breast milk contains that aren't found and aren't really replicatable in human milk. So things like maternal antibodies and hormones. And of course, this figure is a little bit outdated because it doesn't include two of my favorite components related to the microbiome, which are probiotic bacteria or live beneficial bacteria, as well as prebiotic oligosaccharides, which are essentially fiber or food for those gut bacteria. So this is a more updated version of that same image, which does include the prebiotics and probiotics. And my dream is to measure all of these things in milk samples in the child cohort study, and then link them to these different microbiome and health outcomes that we have available. And I think that in the past, a lot of the research on human milk has focused on one component at a time. And there are some advantages to doing that, but it really misses the whole picture, which is that babies consume this whole rainbow of components at once. And so you can see here that we've successfully been able to get funding to study some of these components, but I have a wish list that's always growing because we want to study them all. And since I have limited time here today, I'll just talk about one of them, which is the microbes or the microbiota in breast milk. The milk microbiome is a really hot area of research right now. Until about 10 years ago, it was assumed that breast milk was sterile unless a mom had an infection. But we now know that's not true, and that all healthy women produce milk with live microbes in it. And you can think of these as natural probiotics for their babies. So there's still a lot we don't know about the microbiome in terms of why it's so variable. So this is a picture from one of the earliest papers on the milk microbiome. The different colors are different bacteria and the different columns are different women. And so you can see they're all quite different, but we don't really know why that is. That's what we're still studying. And we have not very much information in terms of what does this actually mean for the baby that's consuming them. So we did a study in the child cohort where we analyzed 400 moms. And you can see this is work by my PhD student who has recently graduated, Sharon Musavi. And again, these are 400 columns of different moms with different colors reflecting different bacteria. So it's highly variable. And when she analyzed all of this data, she found there were sort of 4 clusters that moms would fall into, one of these 4 groups, and they're each dominated by different types of bacteria. And when she asked the question, why are different moms in different bacteria? We looked at things like parity, so whether a mom had previously had another baby, whether the baby was a boy or a girl. We have different centers in the study, so we looked at whether that was important, and we looked at how the mom delivered, by C-section or vaginally. We know that's important for the gut microbiome, but actually none of those things were important for the milk microbiome. What was important, though, was that feeding mode. So coming back to pumping, we saw that in these 4 different groups, there was a significant difference in the proportion of moms who were pumping their milk. And so this to us is a clue that maybe something about pumping versus direct feeding is changing the microbiome of the mom's milk. Right? So it could be that microbes are actually coming from the baby's mouth and colonizing the breast. And so if the baby's not feeding at the breast, that's not happening. It could be that microbes are coming from the pump or apparatus if it's not properly sterilized. We're not sure about the why. That's the next question. But it does raise some interesting questions for further research. And I do want to take a moment to make this PSA, which I always do in these talks now, having learned my lesson. Unfortunately, some of our research has been perceived quite negatively in the media with headlines like this. This really is not the message that we want to deliver. It's not that pumped milk is bad or harmful, but our data do show that it's not equivalent to nursing at the breast. It still shows that it's beneficial compared to formula, that we know pumping can help sustain breastfeeding from other research. So we know that a lot of moms go to a lot of effort to pump and feed their milk. And I wouldn't want to discourage that in any way. I think it's really important. But at the same time, it is important to answer these questions, to understand why there's a difference. Because if it is about the way milk is stored in the freezer or the way it is fed from a bottle, these are things that we could modify and provide advice on. So with that over, the last question that I'll touch on briefly is about milk microbes and what they do in the infant gut. So they're in the milk, but are they actually colonizing the infant gut? We addressed this question by linking the milk and gut microbiome data in the child cohort, a collaboration with several other researchers. And we did find that firstly, the milk and gut microbiome are very different, which is not surprising. The bacteria you find in breast milk are different from those you find in a baby's stool, but there were a few overlapping bacteria that did seem to be shared. And when we mapped these out against each other, we found that they were correlated. So a particular bacteria in a particular mom's milk was correlated with that same bacteria in her own baby's gut. And that was really interesting to us. It suggested that of the thousands of bacteria present in these different sample types, there was a short list of bacteria that are shared, and that might be particularly important. And what was exciting to us is that 2 of these bacteria were among those 4 bacteria that were missing from babies who went on to develop allergies and asthma in our earlier study. So suggesting that breast milk might be an important source of those protective bacteria. We looked, of course, at pumping to see if that made a difference, and we did find that moms who were nursing directly at the breast shared more bacteria with their babies. So again, coming back to this importance of direct nursing. So do milk microbes colonize the gut? It looks like a few ASVs, which you can think of as bacteria, are shared, and that this sharing is higher for moms who nurse versus those who pump. So I think we still don't know the firm answer, but I think maybe some bacteria in the milk do colonize the gut. And that's important because it might suggest that these bacteria could be good candidates as probiotics. So this was the map we started with, and there's many parts that I don't have time to talk about today, but hopefully you've learned something about the gut microbiome, the microbes in milk, and why breastfeeding is so important in promoting healthy growth trajectories. So there are lots of unanswered questions, which maybe I won't have time to go through today, but we could touch on in the Q&A if people are interested. So things about what is a healthy microbiome? How do microbes influence disease risk? How do microbes colonize the gut? And what is the role of pumping? How could we prevent changes in the microbiome if they do occur? Is breastfeeding a part of that? What is the consequence of the variability in human milk? It's so different between different moms. How does that happen and what's the importance of it? Is there a way we could optimize human milk composition? Is there a way we could optimize donor milk composition or matching, since that's very important for premature babies, and so on. So I want to leave time for questions. So I'll thank, first of all my collaborators, the people in my lab, and all of our funders. And if you got excited about human milk today, there is an International Society for Research on Human Milk and Lactation that you could consider joining. There's lots of benefits. I'm currently the secretary, so feel free to reach out for more information. And with that, I would be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Azad. That is absolutely fascinating. There's so much there, and we have a lot of messages of support to your research. That is said, it's very much needed research, and I have a comment here that pumping is stressful. Maybe that's why, answering your question earlier. So thank you so much for shining the light in terms of breast milk and what it is in the long term for babies. So obviously, babies who are in the NICU, moms have to pump, and we hope with that we continue to breastfeed when the baby is ready for it. Do we lose the probiotics, the natural probiotics, when the pumped milk is frozen and then given to the baby at a later date?
That's a great question. So I'll first answer something that you didn't quite ask, but donor milk, so not the mom's own milk, but donor milk in the NICU is pasteurized. So in that milk, we do lose the microbes because the point of pasteurization is to kill bacteria that could potentially cause disease. But when it's a mom's own milk, there's no pasteurization. It just gets frozen. In research labs, we do when we do research on microbes and cells, we freeze them all the time and then thaw them and still study them. So it's possible that bacteria can survive freezing. But it might be that doing that at a certain temperature or in a certain way would be better. And Shirin, the student who did that research on the milk microbiome, actually spent some time at another research lab that specializes in growing bacteria to look at whether bacteria could survive freezing in milk. And so that's something that we're working on now.
Absolutely. So we have a lot of questions with not a lot of time, and I will have to bring you back next year. But I have a question for you in terms of your next research, the one you're working right now with donor milk and matching mother's own milk. Talk a little bit about that, because this is absolutely fascinating, and I want to back next year to talk about it in more depth.
Yeah, so one of the things I mentioned but didn't talk about in depth was prebiotic oligosaccharides that are found in milk. So these are often called human milk oligosaccharides, or HMOs. And these are highly abundant in human milk. They're not found in most infant formulas. And they're, again, really specific. Different moms make different HMOs. And so we're just learning about them. These are actually food for the baby's gut bacteria. It's not food for the baby can't digest it. But they're really important to the microbiome. And one of the things we know about why different moms make different HMOs is related to one single gene and one single letter in that gene. And it makes you either a secretor or a non-secretor. So all of us are one of these two. And if we're a secretor, then we make different HMOs, in particular, one called 2-fucosyl lactose. We make a lot of it. But then other moms who are non-secretors don't make any of that HMO, but they make others. And so you could think of this, and it's actually related to your blood type. So if you think about donating blood and giving that to recipients, we would never just take all the blood donors, pool all the blood together and give it to everyone, right? We specifically type each donor and match it to each recipient. So we're wondering if with donor milk, that would be a good strategy, because right now we pool different milk together, we pasteurize it, and we give it to all the babies in the NICU. So we're doing a study where we are typing each donor mom and each baby's mom and matching the donors based on the baby's own mothers to see if that gives even better outcomes for the premature babies.
That's fascinating. We're looking forward to that. So one last question. We need to improve breastfeeding rates in Canada. The research is there, is beneficial for the baby, whether it's mom's own breast milk, if it's pumped, if it's fresh, if it's frozen, or if it's donated. How can we work as a community of parents, researchers, clinicians to improve that rate in Canada, to give babies a better outcome after the NICU stay?
Excellent question. I want to first just mention the study I just described, the trial on donor milk, is led by my postdoc, Merilee Brockway, and she's right up after me talking about a different study, but I want to give that credit where it's due. She's doing a great job. In terms of supporting breastfeeding, I zipped through some of my last open questions, and the very last one on that screen was, how can we support breastfeeding as a community? Because I think it's really important to recognize that breastfeeding is not an individual responsibility to put on individual moms. It is a societal responsibility. So we need to have support programs, education programs. Moms don't breastfeed on their own. Their families support them. Their communities support them. And one project we have in the lab is about education around breastfeeding for school children. Because I think if all children grew up from a very young age knowing that this is just how we feed babies, there wouldn't be the stigma around breastfeeding in public, the question around should I or shouldn't I. It would just be known that this is how you feed babies. And of course, some moms are still going to have challenges. So we need to not give the impression that because it's natural, it's easy or automatic. So we need support on that side as well. There's a lot to be done, and I appreciate the challenges, but I'm encouraged by some of the initiatives going on in that space.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your work and for sharing your expertise, your knowledge, and your passion. It's so visible that you're so passionate about what you do, and we are so grateful to you to join us on the Preemie Power Week, Dr. Azad. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for having me.
And thank you, everyone, for joining the conversation today. I'll be back in a very short break with Dr. Merilee Brockway, talk about the IPOP study. And in honor of Prematurity Awareness Month, in collaboration with CPBF, Pampers will donate 200,000 diapers to support Canadian families and NICUs during November and December. And until end of December, every time you use the hashtag Pampers for Preemies, Pampers will donate one extra diaper to Canadian ICUs through the CPBF. So join us on that. And I want to thank AbbVie and Pampers for supporting the Preemie Power Week. I also want to thank CPBF team for working so hard this week and make this week happen for all of us. And CPBF is a registered charity, and your donations this week will go to our COVID care program to provide therapy sessions for NICU families. Please donate on our website, canadianpreemies.org. Together, we can create a brighter future for all NICU families. So next session will start in just a few minutes with Dr. Merilee Brockway, examining trends in the global preterm birth rates during the pandemic lockdown. So stay tuned. welcome back if you join us for the first talk of the day. And for those who are joining us now, welcome to day 3 of Preemie Power Week. I'm Fabiana Bacchini, Executive Director of the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation, CPBF, and your host for this event. The Preemie Power Week is the second of 2 international live series that CPBF is hosting 2020 in recognition of World Prematurity Day. These education sessions are in collaboration with the International Family Integrated Care Committee, the Canadian Association for Neonatal Nurses, EFCNI, and GLANS, the Global Alliance for the Newborn Care. For those not familiar with CPBF, we are a charitable organization, and our mission is to support and educate Canadian families of premature babies every step of the way. We believe that through consistent information, access to helpful resources, and peer support inside and outside the NICU, we can empower families, ensuring they are ready to care for their baby. Consistent information is especially important today when we are facing a global pandemic. With educational sessions like this, we intend to bring you the guidance of healthcare professionals and the knowledge gathered by researchers around the world. These are valuable tools to help our community raise awareness and advocate for the well-being of families and their babies. I would like to thank AbbVie for the unrestricted educational grant and Pampers for supporting the Preemie Power Week. And right now, we are going to talk about the emerging trends in preterm birth rates during the pandemic lockdown. There have been 2 small studies that have identified that preterm birth rates fell drastically during the pandemic lockdown. Researchers from the International Perinatal Outcomes in the Pandemic, IPOP study, have gathered a large international group of scientists from over 20 countries to look at these trends and to identify any factors that might have caused these trends to happen. We will discuss these possibilities and invite feedback and discussion from the audience right after Dr. Merilee's presentation. She's joining me here now. Dr. Merilee Brockway is a registered nurse and an international board-certified lactation consultant. She completed her PhD in nursing at the University of Calgary. She's currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Manitoba in Dr. Meghan Azad's lab, our previous speaker, and she's exploring clinical applications of donor human bank and leading the IPOP study. Merilee, thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm so honored to have you joining us from Calgary this afternoon. So I will let you guide us through your presentation and hopefully have a great discussion after.
Thank you, Fabiana, and I'm very pleased to be here talking to everyone in the audience. I'm kind of switching hats, and it's always a hard act to follow Dr. Azad, so I share her passion with breast milk. But in that passion, I also love working with families of premature infants and have done a lot of work in the NICU with breast milk feeding. And I also have a lot of interest in preventing preterm birth because if we prevent preterm birth, then we don't have the babies in the NICU. And that was kind of an interesting trend, as Fabiana alluded to, that we saw an outcome of the pandemic lockdown. We noticed some trends about that. So I'm going to talk about a study where we have developed to explore those trends. It's called the International Perinatal Outcomes in the Pandemic Study, or IPOP, as we fondly call it. So I just want to talk about our leadership team who we've brought together over the past 3 months. And IPOP is a relatively new study, but it has taken quite momentum and gotten going very quickly. So you met Dr. Meghan Azad at the previous session out of the University of Manitoba, myself, Dr. David Bergner, who is a pediatrician out of Australia. Natalie Rodriguez is our project manager or coordinator, and she's out of the University of Manitoba. And then we have Dr. Sarah Stock, who's an OBGYN out of Edinburgh, and Dr. Helga Zawega, who's a perinatal epidemiologist. So she looks at trends population-wide in perinatal health. She's co-assigned, so Australia and Iceland, so we get some nice global perspective from her. And I also want to acknowledge Fabiana and many of her colleagues from the EFCNI have been fantastic champions of the IPOP study and have been working with us to provide patient engagement and their own personal perspectives as parents of premature infants, and we're really incorporating a lot of their work into our study design as well. I probably don't need to talk to you too much about this slide, but we all are aware that preterm birth is a major concern for families, for the healthcare system. They consist of about 1 in 10 births internationally, which works out to about 15 million babies every year that are born prematurely. It can lead to disability or long-term health outcomes. So it's something we really want to look at preventing when possible. Many of you may be aware of some of the media that came out during the pandemic that started to discuss some trends that we saw related to the pandemic lockdown. And we're all familiar with the impact that pandemic lockdown had on our lives as far as not being able to go out. Many of us had restrictions to accessing healthcare. Some of us, or lots of us, had to stay home from work, so we weren't leaving the house that often. And one other trend that was noticed in relation to these lockdowns was that some of the NICUs across the world were reporting lower censuses, or that they had fewer babies in their NICUs. And people started to ask why. Some of you may have seen these articles. This is fairly Canadian-centric, but the Globe and Mail indicated, and we actually noticed this through our milk bank here in Calgary. It's a community milk bank, so it delivers milk to NICUs across Canada, and they stopped really having a lot of orders for milk, so their requests for milk went down. And when they called around to the NICUs to explore why, people were saying, well, we just don't seem to have the babies, we don't really need the milk. So that kind of flagged a red flag, going, well, what's going on? So that was one of our first indications that things were slowing down at the NICUs. And then this other article here by Elizabeth Preston out of the New York Times, she started to call around to researchers and contacted me asking if I knew anything about this trend. And at that point, we really didn't. We had no idea. We had heard murmurings of it from clinicians across Canada and some from other countries, but really nobody had come together to look at the trends. So since then, some other articles have been released indicating that maybe it's not indeed a decrease in preterm birth rates, but potentially an increase in stillbirth rates. So some studies have been released that show that stillbirth rates have increased, particularly or predominantly in lower or middle income countries, but we have seen some trends in some higher income countries as well. And another element that has come out is likely that is due to a reduced access of care, or women not seeking care or feeling that they can seek care if something arises with their pregnancy. So we have kind of a couple of outlining questions here that we really were curious about. And as researchers and clinicians, we started to go, really, like, what is happening here? So we started to ask, is this really happening everywhere, or is it localized to certain sites? And of course, being clinicians and researchers, why is this happening? Like, what is happening? What is the reason? And the other thing we want to know is if this is affecting all pregnant women the same, or are there different reasons? Are pregnant women with other health issues being affected differently, or other socioeconomic status being affected differently? So these were questions that really started to pique our interest. And some of the studies that Fabiana referred to in her introduction, when we started out, there were 2 preprints. So these were not peer-reviewed studies, which is how in science we really move forward on developing evidence, but they were going to be peer-reviewed, were put up showing that preterm birth rates, well, particularly in Ireland, had dropped 73% for very low birth weight infants. And then in Denmark, we saw a 90% reduction in extremely preterm infants. So those were the first 2 studies that really started to say, okay, we're starting to see some evidence here. Again, I acknowledge that they weren't peer-reviewed, but definitely enough for us to move forward with. And then shortly after, one of our collaborators, Dr. Jasper Bean, did quite a nice study looking at preterm birth rates in the Netherlands and showed that early in the lockdown, during the very strict lockdown time, there was about a 15 to 23% reduction in preterm birth rates. And then we had another study come out from a lower middle income country, Nepal, that showed that there was actually an increase in preterm birth, but more concerningly, there was quite a large increase in stillbirths. So at this point, as we were moving forward and starting to develop our study, we sat back and thought, okay, this may not just be looking at preterm birth rates. We really have to consider perinatal outcomes as a whole, stillbirth, low birth weight, and what have you, so that we really get a nice view of what's happening across the world. Some of these studies that we presented, they did have some limitations, and since we started, of course, there's been quite a few more studies published, and we're seeing quite inconsistent results coming out. So from higher income countries, some sites are located or reporting decreased preterm birth rates. Some are reporting increased stillbirth rates. Really from the low and middle income countries, we do see reports of increased stillbirth happening. And another interesting factor to consider that only one study that we're aware of looked at was medically indicated preterm birth or iatrogenic. So when a woman would go in for a prenatal screening and the physician would see that something was wrong and say, we need to induce birth right now. So we've actually seen in some studies quite a significant decrease in those iatrogenic or medically indicated preterm births. So these are all developing the full story for us to look at as we move forward with the IPOP study. But I did want to mention that the studies that have been published to date tend to be really from single hospitals or single sites. So they're not really population or representative of the greater country. Many of them did not account for stillbirths, and none of them are really exploring mechanisms or the reasons why we're seeing this. So these are limitations from those studies and things we're going to be moving forward with in the IPOP study. And then the other thing that really is missing right now, because as I said, predominantly they're single site studies, is looking at the difference between high income and low and middle income countries. So as we sat back to discuss the IPOP study and the proposal, we started to discuss why this might be happening and why we might be seeing differences in trends between pandemic times and non-pandemic times. We kind of came up with a good news, bad news kind of story. So some of the reasons we think that we're seeing reductions in preterm birth, and there is a lot of thinking and evidence to support that preterm birth is often instigated by some sort of inflammation in the mom's system. And it could be any sort of inflammation. It doesn't necessarily have to be an infection. It's not something that's really well understood, but it tends to be our understanding as clinicians and scientists that inflammation can start or instigate preterm birth. So we were thinking about things that might reduce inflammation as a result of the pandemic lockdown. And this is an issue up for debate, but maternal stress, if you think of maternal physical stress from a pandemic perspective, we're not seeing moms really leaving the house to work late in their pregnancy. So lots of moms had to start working from home, or if they had labor intensive jobs, maybe they weren't actually going out and doing that work. We also saw quite a significant increase in personal hygiene as far as hand washing and hand sanitizing. So that in turn may have decreased infections, which is another form of inflammation. Another thought, there's quite a lot of evidence showing that air pollution decreased during the pandemic time because people weren't driving around, factories weren't running. And there's a very strong link between air pollution and preterm birth rates. So that could be another reason. And then another thing to consider is decreased interventions. Because these moms are not being seen as readily by their healthcare practitioners, maybe we're not getting in there and intervening. That goes back to that iatrogenic or medically indicated preterm birth that I talked about. And then kind of looking at the bad news story of the pandemic, things that may be increasing stillbirth or causing negative impacts on moms is there's a lot of emotional and mental stress happening right now. There's fear and anxiety around the pandemic. Many people became unemployed. And of course, lots of families out there that have school-age children know that we all struggled through trying to homeschool on top of doing everything else involved with parenting and the stress of the pandemic. So there was a lot of added stress and emotion happening to moms. The other thing we considered was nutrition, and this can go either way. So those moms, maybe perhaps in more high income settings, maybe were around the house more, eating more, having a bit more nutrition than they were usually used to. But on the other side, usually in lower middle income settings, nutrition maybe became compromised. So access to safe and healthy food sources, if you can't leave, you can't go to the store, that's another consideration to take into the modeling. And then finally, the big thing that we're concerned about is that lack of access to maternity care. So pretty much every pregnant woman during the pandemic lost their consistent access to their care provider. We've heard stories of some women only seeing their care provider one time face-to-face prior to giving birth. So this, of course, will have an impact on the quality of care that women received, and maybe some things were missed. So with that in mind, we have built a protocol that will be capturing data from collaborators that look at these kind of elements, both on a regional and on an individual level scale. So regional, we would be looking at the area around where mom lives, be it in her city or her country. So the OECD index is the economic index of that country. We'll look at how strict the lockdowns were for people in different sites. We're going to consider maternity leave policies because that can provide us some answers as far as moms leaving the house in their pregnancy, because some countries do provide prenatal or maternity leave. Maternity care practices as far as what the minimum standard of care is, and then of course COVID-19 rates. And I want to be clear, we're not looking at COVID-19 infection in mothers, but we can control for high rates of infection to see if that altered the preterm birth rate. And then on the individual level, we're going to be collecting information on maternal socioeconomic status, how many babies they've had, how old they are, their ethnicity, their own personal employment and maternity leave options, if they had pregnancy complications, if they themselves knew they were diagnosed with COVID-19, or if they had any other acute or chronic health concerns that would impact their pregnancy. So the objective of the IPOP study is to investigate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown or restrictions on perinatal outcomes worldwide, and to identify the underlying mechanisms or reasons. And what we really want to do is translate this information to practitioners and clinicians and policymakers globally. And this will help to maximize the evidence so that it's turned into practice quickly and will have a good impact or a better impact on the pandemic as it continues, and perhaps towards future pandemics as they come about, and how we deal with them, looking at reducing access to care or reducing complications related to pandemic lockdown restrictions. And it's really something that we're focusing on to be globally collaborative because we want these questions to be meaningful across the nation, and sometimes they can't be answered when we're just looking at a single site. So the three aims from the study, we're just starting to harness down on aim one, is to describe trends and regional differences. So as I mentioned before, we kind of had conflicting information if the stillbirth rate and if the preterm birth rates have changed. So we first need to answer that question to see where they've changed, if they've changed, and how they've changed. And then once we get that information, we'll move on to aim two to figure out the context and why. So again, this is going to be looking at bigger data from birth records, population level data, but to look at if the changes during the lockdown were correlated with things like air quality or maternity care, and how these changes modified preterm birth rates or stillbirth rates. And then as we move forward with that, we're going to move on to aim 3, which will be a little bit more fine detailed, where we'll be collecting that individual data on mothers to answer the impact of maternal comorbidities or other illnesses or pregnancy complications, their own personal care patterns, and how their own socioeconomics can impact their outcomes. So it is quite a long study as far as our timeline, but we're moving forward quite effectively with aim 1. So we've really been quite conscious to develop a very multidisciplinary team. We have clinicians, neonatologists, and maternal fetal medicine specialists. We have people that specialize in statistics and epidemiology, so population health. We have people that specialize in feminism and maternal rights, and then some artificial intelligence to help us with the modeling as well. We've really embraced a very open science or team science approach to collaborating to ensure that we're inclusive of researchers and clinicians from all over the world. And one of the upsides of the pandemic is it's made remote collaboration very accessible for many. So we use Slack, Google Drive, Zoom to talk to our collaborators all over the world. The biggest constraint on us is the time zones, really. And then we've built some strategic partnerships with knowledge user groups, the Public Health Agency of Canada, Born on Time, and then the International COVID Data Research Alliance, which is an alliance that is helping us manage our data on an international level, because it's actually quite an undertaking to have a bunch of data coming in from countries all over the world to manage it safely and equitably. And then we're really focusing on integrating the knowledge that we have built and translating that effectively. So we've done a lot of stakeholder engagement, we've done a lot of patient engagement, and we'll be moving forward with that throughout our study to ensure that the evidence we find is provided to people that will use it in a very timely manner. So we're really excited about this. Is our map as of November 6th. So as I mentioned, this recruitment of collaborators started less than 3 months ago. And in that time, we've gotten over 100 collaborators across over 42 countries. We have really nice representation from lower and middle income countries, but we're always looking for more. So if you are a researcher out there, or someone who has access to data from other countries, feel free to contact us. And right now, the data that we'll be looking at will cover about 2.4 million births per year. So we've developed a protocol, taken a lot of time to look at consistent data collection and definitions, because when you're working on a global scale, words are very important and have different meanings. So we have really taken a lot of effort to make sure that the words we're using, the terms we're using are consistent for everybody that we're working with. Administrative data collection takes a lot of effort as far as ensuring it's safe and the data are protected, because countries don't like to give up their data to people that they don't know. So we have to ensure that we have all our legalities in place. As I mentioned before, we've built we're collaborating to have this secure digital research environment so that the data will be safe. And then for the statistical experts out there, we're doing an interrupted time series analysis by region. And then we're going to meta-analyze. We're going to take the data from all the different sites that contribute, so 42 countries right now, and we're going to do one study on all of them to tell about the trends that are happening globally. I'm going to skip that and just talk about our governance structure and the people involved in the study. We are really, I've mentioned the leadership core. I want to acknowledge that we've taken very serious consideration of patient engagement and knowledge user engagement from the beginning. This is where Fabiana comes in, and her colleagues have been fantastic as far as informing the study. But what their input is going to be really meaningful for is telling us what mechanisms we should probably be exploring from their own personal experiences. And then we have other experts in air quality, maternal stress, health systems, and infections that are going to be informing what mechanisms or reasons for the preterm birth. And then we have an entire working group dedicated to low and middle income country collaboration to ensure that we're being equitable that we're reducing barriers so that researchers from those countries and parent partners can access us and participate equitably in the project. So what do we hope to come from this study? We hope to discover and understand potentially preventable causes of adverse perinatal outcomes that can impact preterm birth, low birth weight, stillbirth, and neonatal mortality. We've been provided with a natural experiment, essentially, from the pandemic lockdown, and it could provide some better understanding of what causes adverse perinatal outcomes. And we're hoping that we can figure that out, some of that out. We hope to inform future research and maybe develop some interventions to improve perinatal health beyond this pandemic, but also within this pandemic if it continues longer than the next year. We hope to build research capacity. So some of the collaborations that we're building are going to move beyond this pandemic, and we'll be able to look at perinatal health on a global perspective, hopefully in other contexts beyond the pandemic. And that's kind of something that's not really been done very well previously. So we're hoping that these partnerships can help with that. We're hoping to develop robust guidelines for international perinatal outcome research. And then, as I mentioned, establish a sustainable and equitable global research platform. So this draws us to the end of the study or the presentation. So if you are interested in learning more about the IPOP study, I do invite you to visit our website. And if you are potentially interested in collaborating, we do have an intake form on this website that you can fill out, and then we'll contact you with more information. But I do want to thank Fabiana and the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation for inviting us to speak with you today. And I also want to acknowledge the Health Data Research UK, who have provided us with foundational funding to start this project as we move along the timeline. Oh, Fabiana, you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you so much for your presentation. That is absolutely great to see this collaboration happening around the world and really analyze what is happening. Do we have any data available from Canada? What is happening right here?
So unfortunately, the data in Canada is still anecdotal, but we do have it coming. The thing when you're working with population level data is it's quite slow to be available to the researchers because they have to centralize it and make sure that the data are correct or collected correctly. So we're hoping to have that later this month or early next month. But anecdotally, we've seen some variances across the country. Calgary definitely had the biggest drop in our NICU census by far, but we did see some fluctuations across the country, and in other places such as Vancouver and apparently Montreal really didn't see too much change. So it'll be nice to look at that data on a national level.
So when we're going to look at this data from different countries, and I'm thinking about countries like Brazil, where there's so the disparity of care is incredible. If you're born in the Amazon or in a big center like São Paulo, or even Canada, if your baby is born in Ontario, in Toronto, versus a baby who is born in Nunavut, are we going to analyze that data where the numbers dropped by area? Because then you can see, okay, because this area is usually more polluted than people who live in the north of Canada or people who live in the Amazon in Brazil. Are we going to be able to cross that information?
We are, and that's the beauty of having such an international expertise. We've pulled people in that have expertise in air pollution and have expertise in socioeconomics and rural health. So they'll be able to inform our data analysis so that we can be sensitive to those potential influences. And I think that analysis is going to give us a lot of information that we've never had before.
Absolutely. So my next question to you is, when we are talking briefly before, you mentioned that Japan has this prenatal maternity leave. So parents stay home before they deliver the baby. Supposedly they are going to deliver a term baby. Is this something that we are looking at? That is a possibility that parents might need to rest during pregnancy?
It's a great question. So Japan and some other countries do have a prenatal maternity leave where moms go off, I believe, for the last 6 weeks of their pregnancy, and they have a substantially lower preterm birth rate than the global, the background baseline. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why that could be, but this study that's something we're going to be looking at, because we essentially had a forced prenatal maternity leave in a lot of settings. So potentially that could be it. And if we do see that that is potentially a factor, like I said, we've partnered with government in Canada, the Public Health Agency of Canada, and that could be evidence that they're really interested in looking at for policy change.
Absolutely. So when are we going to have some preliminary analysis of that data?
Goodness, I hope early next year. Yeah, it's, as I said, getting data agreements from countries across the world to ensure that everybody is meeting a minimum, or we're addressing a minimum requirement, has been a learning experience, but hopefully we'll develop templates and make it a lot easier for researchers moving forward.
Absolutely. I want to thank you so much for your time today, for sharing this information with us. We are really looking forward to keeping this collaboration going. And I will have to bring you back next year to give all the information and what is happening with that study.
We'll have the big reveal.
Thank you, Dr. Merilee Brockway.
Thank you, Fabiana. Have a great day.
Thank you. And thank you all of you for joining the conversation today. We still have one more session right after a short break with Dr. Nancy Feeley. And in honor of Prematurity Awareness Month, in collaboration with CPBF, Pampers will donate 200,000 diapers to support Canadian families in an ICUs during November and December. Until end of December, every time you use the hashtag Pampers for Preemies, Pampers will donate one extra diaper to Canadian ICUs through the CPBF. So join us. And I would like to thank AbbVie and Pampers for supporting the Preemie Power Week. I also want to thank our team here at CPBF. And we are a registered charity, and all your donations this week will go to our COVID care program to provide therapy sessions for NICU families. Please donate on our website, canadianpreemies.org. Together, we can create a brighter future for all premature babies and families. So next session starts in just a few moments with Dr. Nancy Feeley talking about the NICU fathers and COVID-19, an international study. So stay tuned. We'll be back very shortly. everyone. Welcome back if you have joined us for the first two presentations of the day. And for you who are just joining us now, welcome to the day 3 of Preemie Power Week. I'm Fabiana Bacchini, Executive Director of the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation, CPBF, and your host for this event. The Preemie Power Week is the second of 2 international live series that CPBF is hosting 2020 in recognition of World Prematurity Day. These educational sessions are in collaboration with the International Family Integrated Care Committee, the Canadian Association of Neonatal Nurses, EFCNI, and GLANTS, the Global Alliance for the Newborn Care. For those not familiar with CPBF, we are a charitable organization, and our mission is to support and educate Canadian families of premature babies every step of the way. We believe that through consistent information, access to helpful resources, and peer support inside and outside the NICU, we can empower families, ensuring they are ready to care for their baby. Consistent information is especially important today when we are facing a global pandemic. With educational sessions like this, we intend to bring the guidance of healthcare professionals and the knowledge gathered by researchers around the world. These are valuable tools to help our community raise awareness and advocate for the well-being of families and their babies. And I would like to thank AbbVie for the unrestricted educational grant and Pampers for supporting the Preemie Power Week. And we are going to continue with the COVID-19 information and research that is happening around the world. And right now, we're going to talk about NICU fathers and COVID-19, an international study. Dr. Nancy Feeley is a member of FINESS, an international group of neonatal clinicians and researchers interested in fathers' experience in the NICU. The group has an international study underway to learn about fathers' experiences in the NICU during the COVID pandemic. Her presentation will describe the online study and hopefully some of the preliminary findings related to the challenges fathers have confronted this year. Dr. Nancy Feeley, sharing the screen here with me right now, is an associate professor at the Ingram School of Nursing at McGill University and senior researcher at the Lady Davis Research Institute of the Jewish General Hospital in Montreal, Quebec. Her research focuses on the psychological adjustment and parenting of mothers and fathers of newborns requiring neonatal intensive care. This work is relevant to the current preoccupations of neonatology, the central role of parents in their infants' care and promoting parental mental health. Dr. Feeley, thank you so much for joining me here today. I am so honored to have you here with us. I follow your work for a few years, and I'm so grateful that you are here with us this week, sharing your knowledge and expertise.
Good afternoon, Fabiana. Thank you very, very much for your invitation. I'm really very delighted to be part of this panel of experts that you've put together this week. I've been listening in every day, and every one of the presentations has been absolutely fabulous. And I've been really blown away, so impressed by your program that you've put together, but also your expertise in managing all of this. You've been running a TV production for 3 days. So thank you very much for all you're doing. And I know that at my particular institution, there are staff and parents who've been tuning in. So thank you on all our behalfs. You've managed to make something special of Prematurity Week when there really wasn't too much that we were able to do. So thank you.
Thank you. So I would like to share your presentation. And for all of you watching us at home and the hospital, please send your comments and questions. We're going to address them at the end of Dr. Feeley's presentation.
Okay, so today I'm coming to you from Montreal, as Fabiana said. And my clinical appointment is and as a researcher is at the Jewish General Hospital. And I just want to give a shout out to the staff there who care for babies every day during this pandemic, and all that they do for babies and their parents, and all that they do for me by supporting the studies that I conduct there. So thank you. So I've been involved in the study of fathers for some time because my particular approach to practice and research is to consider the whole family. And we know now from 4 decades of research that are showing us that, father involvement has an important impact on the development of their children, their social development, their emotional development, and their cognitive development. And that fathers' contributions or impact on their children is not the same as mothers. I mean, there are some elements that perhaps overlap, but they do make important, unique contributions, their involvement to the development of their children. And this impact is important for their child, but it's also important for the father and his well-being and his role as a father. So in previous studies that have been done by myself and my students, as well as by other researchers, we really are finding out, discovering evidence that involvement in caregiving during the NICU hospitalization is really essential to the development of fathers' parenting sense of competence, how capable they feel as a father of being involved and contributing to their infant's care and development. Involvement in decision-making during a NICU hospitalization is also a very key form of involvement for fathers. And we've learned also that eye contact between father and infant and feedback from their baby when fathers are interacting with them or in contact with them is very important and critical features of how fathers and infants develop a bond and how fathers develop a sense of themselves as a father. So studies by myself and my students, as well as by other researchers, have really come to understand the importance of this contact or this closeness that occurs in the context of a NICU hospitalization, and how important that is for fathers to develop that bond with their infant and to feel like a father. So one of the things I wanted to highlight, and I didn't have in my presentation originally this week, but while listening to some of the other presentations, I feel that I wanted to include it. And it's this growing knowledge that we are accumulating on what's called the neurobiology of parenting behavior. And I've just cited some of examples of some research that's been appearing in the last decade or so. And it's really pointing to the fact that the neurological and physiological systems of parents and newborns are in communication. There's this interplay going on between them. And what we see is that infant behaviors, whether that be looking at their parents, making movements towards their parents, prompt physiological processes in parents, both mothers and fathers, and that this contributes to the development of the relationship between the parent and their newborn. It stimulates the parent's neurological system and promotes a sense of parental well-being as well. Other evidence points to the importance of visual or auditory cues that babies emit. So baby behaviors, baby eye contact, baby cries are activating regions of the parental brain that we know are coming to understand are implicated in parental behavior. And as I'm sure most of the audience knows, we have this evidence about the importance of skin-to-skin contact and how that's associated with decreasing parents' level of cortisol, their anxiety, and promoting parental well-being. So work by some of the researchers that I have cited here and others is really pointing to the importance of physical closeness between parents, fathers, mothers, and babies, and the importance of that for developing the parent-infant connection. So since 2018, I've been part of a group of researchers and clinicians called Finesse, and we were brought together by the gentleman in this photograph here, Duncan Fitcher. He is not a healthcare professional, but he is somebody who runs a nonprofit in the United Kingdom and who is concerned about parents, but in particular fathers. So what he did was he contacted a number of different researchers from around the world who were studying fathers in the context of a NICU hospitalization and brought us together to look at the evidence that existed to date on fathers in neonatal in intensive care units and really put forth some recommendations for how we could further develop and pay attention to the needs of fathers in the NICU context. So we put together this paper, and it appeared in the Journal of Neonatal Nursing in 2018. So that's the group that I'm part of that's now moved on to develop a study of fathers during COVID. So as everybody has been talking about this week, there were restrictions that were put in place in units across the world. And, we know the reasons as to why these limitations on parental presence were put into place. There were concerns about safety of babies, families, staff, and the spread of COVID-19 in NICUs, wanting to protect the babies from infection, protect staff from infection, to ensure that we have adequate staff in NICUs who are very specialized caregivers who cannot be easily replaced, to care for infants adequately, and also in some settings, concerns about lack of protective equipment availability. So we saw, as many of your guests have already referred to, policies in terms of parental presence that were being enacted in units across the world that varied greatly across countries and varied greatly even within countries. And this was difficult for parents to understand, understandably. And it didn't seem to most of us that the variations in restrictions were based on rates of community transition or risk, or what was going on in the local context. So some researchers in a number of different countries very quickly, wanted to investigate and see what was going on. So we had a group from the United States led by Mahoney here, who actually sent out a survey to hundreds of units in the US mostly, but elsewhere in the world too, through the various associations and contacts that they had. And they had 277 units respond to this survey that occurred, I gather, sometime in March, because the paper here reporting the results came out in April. And this is what their picture told with respect to what was going on in these 277 units. As I said, most of the participating units were in the USA. 24-hour parental presence policy that existed in 83% of the units before COVID fell to 53% in March. Many of the units were restricting access to one parent at a time in the unit. And 25% were saying that only one parent could enter the unit for the entire stay of the infant. So immediately, researchers and clinicians such as myself are thinking about, well, what does this mean for fathers? It's quite likely that they will not be accessing the unit if only one parent is allowed to enter per stay. 5% of the units excluded parents altogether, and 2% even excluded parents if the baby was not doing well, and even in situations of palliative care. So this is a very sad and serious situation with respect to the portrait that it paints with respect to restriction on presence. Another finding that they had was that parents' participation in rounds also decreased from 71%, which was typical in most of these units pre-COVID, down to only 32% in March. So I know that, Fabiana, you spoke of the importance of your being able to participate in rounds at your son's bedside earlier this week. And, so what impact is this having on parents' role in decision-making about their child's care? So, as Bainter et al. And others have noticed, these restrictions and social distancing that are being, enacted in units across the world on parental presence has created great difficulties for families, with many, many ripple effects, of which we can only begin to grasp what some of these might be. And these, ripple effects would include effects on parents' level of stress, their anxiety, their sadness, their frustration, their relationship with their infant, their relationship with their partner, etc. So looking to fathers now, we know that in light of what was going on, there were already stressors on families in the NICU context, and now we have additional stressors on fathers dealing with older siblings at home, the fact that probably support from friends and family was less in the context of COVID because of restrictions that were going on in the communities at large around them, concerns about being able to commute safely to the unit to be present, even if they could be present, financial challenges, perhaps changes in their own employment that may be occurring as a result of COVID, separation from their infant, separation from their partner, and accessing information and participating in decision-making, which, as I mentioned earlier, are very, very important aspects of father's involvement during a NICU hospitalization. So in light of all these stressors that we were imagining that were existing for fathers, on top of the usual stressors that are inherent in a NICU hospitalization, we decided to undertake a study. We also put together a letter that was published by our group in BMJ Global Health in June, talking about our concerns about the restrictions that were enacted and their impact on fathers, infants, and mothers. And, you know, I put this particular illustration here of a feeling that we were making a step backwards in my presentation well before I listened to any of the presentations earlier this week. And it seems that almost every one of your presenters have mentioned this feeling of a sense of falling backwards and, you know, regressing in the progress that we've made with respect to parents in the NICU context. So, you know, we argued for looking at the rationale, the underlying evidence that was leading to these restrictions and raising concerns about the many impacts these might be having, those ripple effects on fathers and their infant and their families. So this is our large team from Finesse, and we then put together a survey that we launched. We were able to launch in July 2020 this year. It's an online survey and it's currently active, and we're continuing to invite fathers to participate in this survey so that we can understand what the impact of COVID and restrictions that are occurring or not occurring, but just COVID in general, on fathers in the NICU context. So this survey of fathers, is being led by one of the investigators here, Esther Adama, who is a nurse researcher in Australia, working with this team of clinicians and researchers from many different countries, all included in the Finesse group. And here you see that I've inserted links here to LinkedIn and Facebook links that can be used to access our survey. If there are any fathers out there, we're hoping that you will participate in our survey. So what I'm going to do today is just tell you a little bit about the survey, what it involves, what we're looking at, and also just a little hint at preliminary results from certain aspects of the survey. So we are asking fathers to tell us about their exposure to COVID-19 symptoms, any diagnosis that's happening for themselves, their infant, or their family members. What are the restrictions that they've been subjected to during their infant's hospital stay? Any restrictions that were also put in place that are restricting their ability to interact and be with their partner at this time. We're asking them to describe the worries that they have as part of the hospitalization and as a result of COVID-19. We're asking them about their involvement in their infant's caregiving during this pandemic, symptoms of stress that they're experiencing, sources of stress. So what are the stressors that they're confronting? What support are they receiving and have available to them during this pandemic? And any support that was provided to them after they were discharged from the unit. So those are the types of questions that we're asking about in this survey. And it's typically taking fathers about 20 minutes to complete the survey, those have participated to date, and a little bit more if they have more to say in response to some of the open-ended questions that we've included. So to date, we've had 52 fathers participate. Most who have participated to date, 40 of the 52, are from the United Kingdom. And I think most of the audience knows that this is a place where restrictions on parental presence were quite evident and very restrictive. So it's not surprising. Plus, we have a number of team members from the UK, so they were able to elicit paternal participation early on in our survey. So, and then we have a few other participants from Canada, Italy, and elsewhere. But for the most part right now, most of the participants are from the UK, and we'd like to really see broader participation from fathers from other countries so that we can paint a portrait and describe what's gone on in different countries. The fathers who have participated thus far, most of them are between the ages of 25 and 44. About half, a little bit more than half, are having their first child hospitalized in the NICU. Most of them are married or cohabitating with their partner. This is interesting. 90% of them were employed full-time before COVID, but only 75% after the start of the pandemic. So here we can see some of our concerns about employment stressors that may be impacting on fathers as well, who are often the primary breadwinners during, postpartum. When we asked about fathers' experience with COVID, we saw that none of them had themselves tested positive. In one case, one of their partners had tested positive. And in one case, one infant had tested positive. So we're not seeing much actual COVID illness experience for fathers, infants, or their partners. Few of the fathers had actually even had tested or had contact with anybody who had tested positive. Some of them, a small percentage, almost 10%, had a family or friend hospitalized, and some had even experienced the death of someone close to them. So here again, we see some of the possible additional stressors that may be facing fathers during this pandemic. Here we've asked about restrictions, and you'll see that some fathers may have experienced more than one of these restrictions. So in case of 8 fathers, only the mother was permitted in the unit for the stay of the infant. In other cases, 2 fathers stated that only 1 parent per day was allowed in the unit. Limitations on the times that they could enter the unit or the hours at which they could enter the unit were restricted. And I think many of you might know that if fathers are employed, they tend to be in the unit at the end of the workday and into the evening. I know on our unit at in the hospital in Montreal, they talk about the guys are here in the evening. And so if limitations are on actual times of entry, then fathers may be not able to be present at those times of entry. In some cases, they're only able to enter 1 time per day. So there's no going in and out of the unit. Once you go in, you can only come out that day and not return until the next day. So if you're obviously juggling other responsibilities and stressors at the same time, this may pose a problem. And so 24 of the fathers who responded thus far have told us that this was their situation. And in only 11 fathers' cases of the 52 that have participated thus far, were there actually no restrictions at all on their ability to enter and leave the unit. When we ask them about restrictions on their interactions with their partners, we see here that it's sort of equally divided, and that there were no restrictions on their ability to be present with their partner in almost 30% of the cases. And then some were having some restrictions and others no restrictions. Only about 1 in 4 fathers were not confronting any restrictions with respect to their ability to be with their partner. So obviously those kinds of restrictions are going to have an impact on the support that fathers are able to receive and also the support that mothers are able to receive. We asked about restrictions on other family members entering the unit. And as you can see, restrictions on entry of others into the unit are very, very common, with grandparents not being permitted to enter in almost 90% of the father's cases, and siblings not being able to enter the unit in almost 80% of the father's cases. Then we asked fathers about the top 3 sources of stress due to COVID-19 now. And you can see that for 35% of the fathers, their main source of stress was the impact on their baby. What was this situation of the NICU hospitalization in the context of COVID and parental access perhaps being limited? What was that impact going to be for their baby? They were also preoccupied, 25% of them, with the impact on their partners. They were also concerned, about a quarter of them, with respect to the impact on their own general well-being during this time. And also concerned about impact on family members at large, whether that be siblings that might be at home, grandparents, and other extended family members. So what I'm hoping going forward is that we really have a more evidence-based approach to decisions about presence, being very mindful of the need for family-centered or family-integrated care, and also a respect for and an understanding of the evidence about the importance of parent-infant proximity for both mother and father. I think we need to develop and communicate policies very clearly and transparently with a solid rationale for why decisions are being made about presence of parents in our NICUs. And we need to use, as many of our speakers have already talked about this week, novel approaches to keep families in communication with one another and with the staff in the neonatal intensive care units as well. And look at innovative ways to provide support to families in the context of the COVID pandemic. Now, many of you, or some of you may know that in recent years, there's been increasing numbers of father support groups or father group activities on many NICUs in many countries across the world. This one in particular is called Special Care Unit Dads, and Matt Cray here in the photo below, he is a nurse from this unit in Newcastle upon Tyne in England. And Matt is really the driving force behind this particular group. And here you see in the photo a group of dads that are meeting. And, you know, they were able to do this, and they've been doing this now since 2017, having monthly group meetings, and expanding that program to include former dads of premature infants cared for in their unit, who are providing support to dads who are currently in the unit. And so all of this was, you know, rapidly moving forward and developing and really providing an important source of information and support for fathers whose infants were currently in the NICU. And unfortunately, you know, they weren't able to go and continue when COVID hit. But, you know, Matt and his group very quickly moved on to Zoom and are now doing this virtually. So here we see an example of, you know, being able to continue to support parents in the context of the COVID pandemic and meet the needs of fathers in particular, who may have particular challenges that they're facing because of decisions that units are taking about access to their units. So what I'd like to do today is invite fathers to participate in our study and share what your experience has been like if you are the father of an infant that's been hospitalized during the pandemic. Our survey is available online, and I'll tell you about that, how to access it next. It takes most people about 20 minutes to complete it. It may take more if you have a lot to say and tell us in response to some of the open-ended questions. And if you have a lot to share with respect to your own personal experience during the pandemic, we'd like to hear about it. So we have we're a team of international researchers, I think, as you saw before. So you can complete the survey in English, you can complete the survey in Italian, and you can complete the survey in French. So those are the languages that we currently have available to us. And here are the links to the survey in various platforms where you can, connect up and tell us what your experience has been like during this pandemic. There's the French version by one of the French Francophone researchers from France on our team. And I want to thank you, Fabiana, for putting together this amazing week of presentations. It's been wonderful to be able to have an opportunity to mark, World Prematurity Day. Given that, we're not able to do the usual things that we would do on this day in our own centers. So thank you for giving us this opportunity to get together and to share knowledge and to learn about parents' experience during this pandemic.
Feeley, what a great presentation. It's so very important to include dads in this conversation. And the stories we've been hearing are absolutely heartbreaking. I don't know if you watched Laurie Romans, this parent from Northern Ontario on Monday, who got transferred to Winnipeg, and her husband could only meet the baby 37 days after the baby was born. He was not allowed to cross the border of the provinces because of the pandemic. And we've been hearing even like in other units in Canada where they only allowing one parent at a time, even when baby is in palliative care. And we had a few cases that baby passed away and only mom was present at a time, which is absolutely devastating. So my question to you is, considering that fathers are not present in those moments or in the care at all with the baby during the ICU or reduced hours in the ICU, what do you see the implications on long term for the fathers and the moms?
Well, that's a really excellent question. And, we don't know, because this is a really unusual circumstance that most of us have not encountered before. I think that we have a lot to learn about that. There are, definitely some units that are using novel technologies or whatnot to be able to connect parents and babies. So we really don't understand all of this. So that's an important question, but one that's difficult to answer.
So from your experience work with dads for many years in research, we know the impact on dads in the ICU. We know there is more PTSD on dads, or dads cope very different than ICU than moms do. So you know that impact. How can we at this time create more support for fathers? Because if they're worried about their jobs, you show in your statistic that dads lost the jobs in the pandemic. So that is obviously a main source of stress for fathers as they become the one breadwinner during parental leave in many cases. And I'm talking about Canada, where we actually have an extended parental leave period. So how do we see us coming together as a community to support the fathers?
Well, I think that we're seeing a growth in those support groups, such as that by Matt Cray. And so, participating in those kinds of support groups, if you have access to it, Matt's operates out of the UK, but I know that there are others in other countries around the world. I think that units could be even setting up opportunities for fathers to get together virtually on various platforms that we have available to us. So, that may help. I see this as a sort of a second option. It's not obviously ideal, but in the context of what's going on, we need to make the best of it and optimize opportunities. So using virtual platforms, I think, is not the first choice I would make, but that there are other options that we can employ. You can see how Matt, those dads in his units were meeting face to face, but they quickly moved over to Zoom and have been able to continue. It's not quite the same, but it's something that's still possible. Not ideal, but possible.
Absolutely. And I think fathers groups are very important. And sometimes I talk to my husband about it. If he would go to those groups, he said, if I had to talk about feelings, I wouldn't. But we're going to talk about, work and what is happening at work. And he still tells me the conversations he had with other dads in the unit that were not about their emotions and feelings and how they were processing their ICU. And I think that has to be a change in the way we think fathers need support, because we always come from the place of supporting emotionally. And sometimes daddies come together to watch a hockey game or drink a beer at the pub, which is a lot of fathers at IWK were getting together to go to the pub. And that was their way of supporting one another. So do we have to change the way we approach fathers to get them more involved and perhaps cope in a different way?
No, I don't think they need to cope in a different way, but we have to figure out how it is that they're coping and then support that. And so you can see that, there are groups that have been successful, such as Matt Cray. And, so it isn't about sitting around and sharing your feelings. So they may do things differently than the women may do if they were, coming to a mother's group. But nonetheless, it is supportive for them to be together because they're sharing an experience and sharing some time and sharing some tips on how to, manage in the context of their infant's hospitalization. So I think we need to respect their way of dealing with it and, provide them with a forum that works for them. And so that may be quite different than what mothers may require or what mothers may seek. And, certainly Matt and others have been very successful at rallying around fathers and figuring that out. And, his group is growing across the UK. So they've been able to grow that group, which is really nice to see.
Absolutely. And I think this is another topic. Another point that is very important to remember is initiated by a man, because sometimes it's like, okay, the most social workers in hospitals are females, and it's a different relation when they go to a father's group where it's run by a male doctor. This is what I've seen around. The more successful groups are the ones like Dr. Macmillan and IWK and another father that was running there. It's Jonathan Foster, who runs the group at Michael Guerin. So I think having this father figure running the groups is very important. If any hospital is here listening to us to how to start and engage fathers, I think it has to be that initiation from a different point of view.
Yes, I agree that the leaders that have been successful, like Matt is a neonatal intensive care transport nurse, but he's a father. And then, he participates with a neonatologist who's male as well. So I agree that, having the involvement of staff who are men, working with fathers is probably obviously more conducive to actually getting these things off the ground, because, they're better able to relate to one another and understand one another's experiences. So, and do things in a different way. It doesn't have it, what fathers want isn't necessarily what mothers want. And we have to understand and respect that.
Absolutely. We have a hello from Spain, from Madrid. And also we have a comment from Karen Beatty. She runs family groups at McMaster. And she said, our dad's pizza nights were very successful prior to COVID. And I'm hoping we can resume that in the near future. But Dr. Feeley, when are we going to have some preliminary analysis of the data you've been collecting?
Well, we're hoping to have more participants during this second wave. So, as I presented, who's participated so far, it's primarily fathers from the United Kingdom. And I would please encourage fathers from Canadian units, especially those that have restrictions or challenges in place, from participants from all over the world. We're hoping to have an international group of fathers who are participating in our study. I showed you all of the links, the different ways that fathers can access the survey. It only takes about 20 minutes, and we're hoping to have many more participants through this second wave so that we can really understand the challenges that fathers have faced worldwide and can share that with you at some later point in the new year.
Absolutely. And we're going to continue to disseminate that survey, hoping to get more fathers to answer those questions. And yes, we are people ask if you're sharing the link. Yes, we are sharing the link on our comments, and it is in English, French, and Italian, and as well as your Facebook page. Dr. Feeley, thank you so much for joining us here today, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. And I'm really looking forward to see the results of your research next year, and hopefully can implement some of the change that will come with the recommendations from your research. So thank you so much for today.
Thank you for your attention to fathers, Fabiana. Thank you.
And for all of you, thank you for joining the conversation today. We are very grateful to have audience on Facebook and YouTube right now. This is the first time you're streaming on YouTube, and you're very happy to see many of you joining us from that platform. And in honor of Prematurity Awareness Month, in collaboration with CPBF, Pampers will donate 200,000 diapers to support Canadian families and in ICUs during November and December. Until the end of December, every time you use the hashtag Pampers for Preemies, Pampers will donate 1 extra diaper to Canadian ICUs through CPBF. So please join the campaign. And I also would like to thank AbbVie and Pampers for supporting the Preemie Power Week. And also want to thank the CPBF team, especially Renata and Patricia, really help with the technology and get all the speakers together to make this week happen for us. And we are a registered charity, and all your donations this week, we go to our COVID care program to provide therapy sessions for NICU families. Please donate on our website, CanadianPreemies.org. Together, we can create a brighter future for all NICU families. So tomorrow, we have a very busy agenda, and I'm very excited that we're going to talk about the use of technology in the NICU with Dr. Jessica Duby from Montreal, Dr. Mehaboub Sharif Sheikh from Edmonton, Dr. Marcia Campoyo from IWK Halifax, and of course, I'm going to bring an ICU parent, veteran parent, Jackie Horrigan, talking about connecting and communicating well with preemie parents virtually and bedside. So join us tomorrow, 12 p.m. Eastern Time, which is 4 amazing speakers on day 4 of Preemie Power Week. Stay well, and thank you all for joining us today.